Welcome to the adventure of the Curator's Conundrum, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series The Feminine Mystique. Sherlock Holmes and the Women of Baker Street, playing in the year 1895. It was only during recent renovations at our old Baker Street lodgings that a rather remarkable trunk came to light, tucked away in the attic. Within, I discovered a collection of personal diaries and letters, penned by various women whose lives intersected with Mr. Sherlock Holmes's investigations between the years 1888 and 1914. These intimate accounts, which I have termed the feminine mystique, Sherlock Holmes and the Women of Baker Street, offer an altogether different perspective on those stirring times, revealing how Holmes himself was often challenged by women who defied the strictures of our Victorian society, forcing us both to reconsider the very nature of justice in an era of profound change. From this unique collection, I shall now relate a most curious affair. Let us begin with the adventure of the Curator's Conundrum. Chapter 1. January's damp chill had settled over London. One blustery afternoon, I accompanied Holmes not on some grim errand, but to Mrs. Hudson's Suffragist Salon. Her parlor hummed with earnest conversation, punctuated by rattling teacups and wind moaning against the panes, carrying the scent of wet coal smoke. Mrs. Hudson greeted us, her voice warm and welcoming above the gentle hubbub. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." Mrs. Hudson's eyes twinkled with warmth. "How good of you to join us. Margaret here has been positively bursting to speak with you," Mrs. Hudson replied. Margaret Lestrade, whom we knew from these gatherings, possessed a keen mind and usually composed demeanor. Today, however, her face was flushed, her hands clasped tightly. She rose as we approached, her skirts rustling with agitation. She addressed Holmes, her voice trembling slightly with distress. "Mr. Holmes, thank heaven you are here. It is about Miss Verity Thorne at the British Museum. A terrible injustice is being done," answered Margaret Lestrade. Holmes, who had been observing the assembly with a detached air, inclined his head, a flicker of polite interest in his grey eyes. Holmes responded, his tone neutral as he invited her to continue. "Pray, Miss Lestrade, compose yourself and tell us what has occurred," Sherlock Holmes said. She took a steadying breath, the passion in her eyes undiminished. "They accuse her of stealing the amulet of Sekhmet. Verity, of all people. I was at the museum only yesterday, shortly after the discovery. The official account claims the theft occurred overnight, after the final checks. But I observed things, Mr. Holmes, discrepancies," Margaret Lestrade answered. She leaned forward, her voice gaining strength and intensity as she detailed her observations, commanding attention. "There was a disturbance in the dust, sir, beside the plinth where the amulet was displayed. Not a general scattering, but a clear, arcing sweep, as if a long skirt had brushed past very recently, certainly more recently than the previous evening's closure. And the scent. The gallery usually smells of beeswax and old paper, but there was a faint, yet distinct, aroma of carbolic solution, the kind they use for cleaning in the basement archives, never in the public galleries. It was strongest near the display case itself," answered Margaret Lestrade. I saw Holmes's eyebrows lift almost imperceptibly. His detached politeness yielded to focused attention. He remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on Miss Lestrade. Holmes remarked quietly, his voice cutting through her impassioned plea. "These are specific observations, Miss Lestrade. The scent of a particular cleaning agent is not a detail one fabricates easily. You are quite certain of this carbolic aroma," explained Sherlock Holmes. She affirmed her conviction clear. "Absolutely, Mr. Holmes. My father was a physician. I know the smell intimately. It was out of place, I tell you. They are railroading that poor girl, and I believe someone else is responsible," answered Margaret Lestrade. Later that evening, in the fog-wreathed familiarity of 221 B. Baker Street, the fire crackled merrily, a sharp contrast to Miss Lestrade's earlier gloom. Holmes paced before the hearth, pipe smoke wreathing his head. A curious tale, Holmes. Do you place any credence in it? The museum authorities seem convinced of Miss Thorne's guilt, wondered Dr. John Watson. Holmes halted abruptly, pivoting on his heel to face me. His eyes, usually cool and detached, now gleamed with that familiar spark of intellectual excitement I knew so well. The museum authorities, Watson, are often more concerned with the swift resolution of an embarrassment than with the intricate pursuit of truth. Miss Lestrade's emotional investment is clear, yet her observations are precise. Disturbed dust might be misinterpreted, but a specific, out-of-place chemical scent, that is a tangible thread. It suggests a presence, an action that does not align with the official narrative. It warrants a closer look, would you not agree? Remarked Sherlock Holmes. He tapped the ash from his pipe into the grate with a decisive gesture. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall pay a visit to the British Museum. We must see this plundered display for ourselves. And so, it seemed, another perplexing adventure, born from a plea in a suffragist's parlor, was about to unfold. The following morning, a chill November mist still clung to the London streets as Holmes and I made our way to the British Museum. The great grey edifice loomed before us. Its imposing columns seemed to stand guard over the treasures within. Our footsteps echoed somewhat hollowly in the vast entrance hall. Usually bustling, it was now imbued with a hushed solemnity. It felt as if the very stones were aware of the recent violation. A liveried attendant met us. Upon hearing Holmes's name, he conducted us towards the Egyptian Antiquities Gallery, showing a mixture of deference and apprehension. The air hung cool and still, laden with ancient dust. Holmes detected a faint chemical odor. His interest peaked momentarily before the mustier scent of antiquity overwhelmed it. Dr. Alastair Finch, the head curator, awaited us. He was a portly man, with a florid complexion and an air of beleaguered importance. His greeting was curt, his handshake brief and damp. Dr. Finch's voice was rather resonant. I suspected he was accustomed to lecturing. Mr. Holmes, an unfortunate business, most unfortunate. The police have their theories, of course. Quite straightforward, they believe, remarked Dr. Alastair Finch. Holmes merely inclined his head. And you, Dr. Finch, what is your belief? Sherlock Holmes said. Finch puffed out his chest slightly. His gaze swept over the nearby exhibits, as if to draw strength from their silent testimony. It is regrettably plain, sir. Miss Thorne, my assistant curator, a clever girl, perhaps too clever for her station. She had the access, the opportunity. The amulet is small, easily concealed. A moment of weakness, a sudden temptation, the usual dreary story. Dr. Alastair Finch said. He spoke with a dismissive wave of his hand, as though the matter were already settled beyond sensible dispute. He led us to the plundered display case. It was a heavy glass and mahogany structure. Now it was starkly empty, save for a velvet cushion. This cushion bore the indentation of the missing artifact. A single pane of glass at the rear had been neatly, almost surgically, removed. The official account suggests entry through that window, I presume, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Holmes asked this, his keen eyes already darting about, missing no detail. Finch nodded, his expression firm. Precisely. The night watchman on this floor was regrettably lax. Miss Thorne would have known his patrol patterns, said Dr. Alastair Finch. Holmes crouched low. He examined the floor around the cabinet, then the cabinet itself. He paid particular attention to a small, ornate stand. It had presumably supported a descriptive plaque and was now lying on its side, a few inches from its original position. His long, nimble fingers traced the polished wood of the stand and the floor where it had rested. The silence in the gallery was broken only by the distant, muffled clang of a gate and the rustle of Finch's impatient shifting. Holmes rose, a thoughtful expression on his face. Interesting, this stand, Dr. Finch, it is displaced. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. The curator offered a condescending smile. A minor detail, Mr. Holmes, no doubt knocked over in the thief's haste, Dr. Alastair Finch said. Holmes's reply was quiet, yet it carried an edge that cut through Finch's complacency. Perhaps, yet observe its position. It has fallen towards the main aisle, away from the window you indicate as the point of entry and egress. If someone reaching from that window or retreating towards it had dislodged it, the force would surely have propelled it inwards. Or, at the very least, it would have moved parallel to the cabinet. Sherlock Holmes responded. Finch blinked, his pomposity momentarily deflated. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He was clearly unaccustomed to having his pronouncements questioned with such precision. Holmes continued, his voice gathering a crisp authority. Furthermore, Holmes continued, this scuff mark on the parquet floor tells us something. It wasn't merely knocked over. It was pushed, deliberately, from a point closer to the public area. This suggests someone approached from a different direction than you and the constables have assumed, explained Sherlock Holmes. I saw a flicker of doubt in Dr. Finch's eyes, though it was quickly suppressed. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. Speculation, Mr. Holmes. The evidence against Miss Thorne is quite compelling, I assure you. Her proximity, her knowledge, Dr. Alastair Finch said. Holmes cut him short, though not impolitely. Compelling, perhaps, but not yet conclusive. I should very much like to hear Miss Thorne's own account of this matter, replied Sherlock Holmes. He then turned to me, his eyes bright with a renewed spark of interest. Tell me, Watson, he said, did not Mrs. Hudson mention Miss Thorne resides in Bloomsbury? It seems our next port of call is clear. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. The prospect of interviewing the accused woman herself lent a fresh impetus to our investigation, especially after Holmes's unsettling observations. Dr. Finch, it was clear, was not entirely pleased by this turn. However, Holmes offered no further debate. He gave merely a curt nod of farewell before we departed the silent, echoing halls of the great museum. We left the curator to his plundered display and his certainties. Our hansom clattered to a halt before a modest terraced house in a quiet Bloomsbury street. The jingle of the harness and the driver's call to the horse were distinct sounds in the otherwise peaceful thoroughfare. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows that danced with the gentle sway of the gas lamps, their flames just beginning to bloom. The air was still, carrying the faint, scholarly scent of old paper and bindings, perhaps from the nearby university, and the distant, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Holmes had been unusually taciturn since our departure from the British Museum, his mind clearly occupied with the inconsistencies pointed out by Dr. Finch, and those he himself had observed. As we stepped onto the pavement, I ventured a remark. You've been remarkably quiet since we left the museum, Holmes. Still pondering Finch's rather hasty conclusions, or have your own theories begun to crystallize? Dr. John Watson commented. Patience, Watson. The clay is still soft. Let us not rush the mold, explained Sherlock Holmes. A moment later, the scrape of a key in the lock preceded the door opening, and we were ushered into a small, rather cluttered parlor. The scent of old books and brewing tea filled the air. Books and papers seemed to occupy every available surface, a testament to a scholarly life. Miss Verity Thorne rose to greet us, the slight rustle of her dress audible in the quiet room. She was a woman of perhaps 30 years, plainly dressed, with intelligent eyes that, despite a visible weariness, held a spark of defiance. The gentle clink of a teacup placed hastily on a saucer was the only sound for a moment as she composed herself. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming. I hardly know where to begin, answered Miss Verity Thorne. Begin, Miss Thorne, with the amulet. Describe it to me, if you please, not as a stolen object, but as an artifact you have studied, explained Sherlock Holmes. A flicker of surprise, then appreciation, crossed her features. She gestured to a stack of meticulously ordered notebooks on a nearby table, the edges of which were feathered with countless slips of paper. The amulet of Thoth, she began, her voice now imbued with a quiet passion that transformed her demeanor, is unique not merely for its lapis lazuli inlay, but for its extraordinarily complex clasp. It is a dual-pin mechanism, requiring simultaneous pressure on two almost invisible studs hidden within the hieroglyphic carvings. Only a handful of us at the museum, myself included, were privy to its precise operation. It was designed to prevent accidental opening, or indeed easy theft, answered Miss Verity Thorne. Good heavens, Miss Thorne. So it wasn't merely a case of smashing a display and grabbing the artifact then. Such a mechanism sounds as if it would require considerable finesse, commented Dr. John Watson. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes glinting with sudden interest. Through the window came the quiet hum of Bloomsbury life and a distant vendor's call, unnoticed by us as we focused on Miss Thorne's words. And this detail, Miss Thorne, he interjected, his voice sharp now, was it common knowledge? Did Dr. Finch, for instance, fully appreciate this intricacy? Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. A faint, bitter smile touched her lips. Dr. Finch, Mr. Holmes, is a man of broad administrative strokes, not fine mechanical details. He would have known it was secure, but not the precise method of its undoing. The official report, I believe, suggests the amulet was simply snatched from its display. Such an action would almost certainly have damaged the clasp or the mounting. Was there any mention of such damage? Miss Verity Thorne said. None whatsoever, Miss Thorne. If memory serves, Dr. Finch emphasized the lack of any struggle, attributing the ease of its removal to your supposed familiarity with the exhibit. Dr. John Watson inquired. Holmes, who had been listening intently, straightened, a look of profound concentration upon his face. He rose and began to pace the small room, a loose floorboard creaking faintly under his tread. Indeed, he said, stopping abruptly. No mention of damage. Dr. Finch emphasized the neatness of the theft, attributing it to your supposed familiarity. Yet your description of this clasp mechanism introduces a significant complication. To remove it cleanly would require specific knowledge and a steady hand, not a panicked grab. The angle of the display stand I observed, too, suggested a more deliberate, careful approach from an unexpected direction, observed Sherlock Holmes. He picked up one of Miss Thorne's notebooks. The soft whisper of turning pages accompanied his examination. Its pages were filled with a neat, scholarly script and intricate drawings of artifacts. His fingers traced a sketch of the very amulet in question, the paper crinkling faintly beneath his touch. Your research, Miss Thorne, he remarked, his voice holding a new note of respect, is exemplary. This level of detail is illuminating. It suggests a thief who knew precisely what they were seeking and how to obtain it without force. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Her eyes, which had been downcast, lifted to meet his, a glimmer of hope dawning within them. Then you believe me, Mr. Holmes? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Miss Verity Thorne replied. I believe, Miss Thorne, he replied, his gaze steady, that there is far more to this affair than meets the eye. Your testimony about the clasp is crucial, but to clear your name, we must delve deeper. We need to uncover the hidden currents within the museum, and perhaps beyond, stated Sherlock Holmes. And you may count on our utmost discretion and effort in that pursuit, Miss Thorne. Holmes has a remarkable talent for navigating such murky waters. Dr. John Watson replied. Holmes closed the notebook with a decisive snap, a sound that seemed to signal a new direction in his investigation. Miss Thorne offered a small, grateful nod to my words, though her gaze quickly returned to Holmes, awaiting his lead. The game, I sensed, was taking a more complex and intriguing turn. It was moving beyond the confines of a simple theft to something altogether more labyrinthine, and the quiet ticking of the hall clock, which I had noted upon our entry, seemed to underscore the unfolding mystery. The previous evening's interview with Miss Verity Thorne had left Holmes in a decidedly contemplative mood, a state I always found particularly intriguing. He had paced our Baker Street rooms for a good hour after my return, the rhythmic creak of the floorboards, a familiar counterpoint to the distant clatter of hansoms on the rain-slicked cobbles outside. Miss Thorne's detailed knowledge of the amulet's clasp, a point seemingly overlooked by the official investigation, had clearly unsettled his initial presumptions. Now, as a thin morning light filtered through the grimy window panes, he sat hunched over her research notes, a frown etched upon his brow, the very picture of intellectual absorption. A sharp, decisive rap upon our door announced a visitor. Mrs. Hudson presently ushered in a young woman, one of the more recent recruits to Holmes's ever-expanding informal intelligence network, the Baker Street Irregular Sisterhood, as he had rather grandly begun to term this particular branch. Her name, I learned, was Polly, and she clutched a small, dog-eared notebook, her breath coming in short, excited gasps, clearly bursting with her news. Her voice, though eager, was steady. "Mr. Holmes, sir, I've news from the museum, and from the dealers, too," responded Polly. Holmes encouraged, leaning forward slightly, his keen eyes fixed upon her. "Pray, omit nothing, however trivial it may seem," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Polly took a steadying breath, the faint scent of damp wool and city air clinging to her, her youthful eagerness a stark contrast to the grim nature of our usual inquiries. "Well, sir, in the archives, it was quieter than a crypt mostly. Just the rustle of turning pages and the scratching of nibs," Polly replied. "But I positioned myself near Dr. Finch's office. His voice carried, sir. Quite sharp it was when he spoke to a junior clerk," remarked Polly. Polly glanced at a notebook. "He said, and I wrote it down verbatim, Miss Thorne's recent activities have cast an unwelcome shadow. We must ensure the museum's reputation remains pristine." His tone was clipped, sir, very stern. Holmes nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding, that particular gleam I knew so well lighting his eyes. He was already fitting this new piece into his intricate mental puzzle. Then, later, sir, I overheard two of the senior librarians whispering amongst the stacks. One, a stout fellow with spectacles, he muttered, his voice rather gravelly. "Finch is in a terrible state about that last Egyptian consignment. Heard he blames young Thorne for drawing too much attention to our acquisition methods," replied Polly. "The other, sir, he just shook his head. His voice was a low rumble, very quiet, and he said, 'It's always easier to blame the assistant, isn't it?'" replied Polly. Polly then shifted her attention to the antiquities dealers, her narrative, delivered with surprising clarity for one so young, taking us from the hallowed silence of the museum to the more furtive, and to my mind, less savory atmosphere of London's back alleys. "Down by Bloomsbury Street, sir, there's a shop dimly lit, smells of dust and foreign spices. The proprietor is a Mr. Abrahams," Polly said. "While I was observing, a nervous-looking gentleman came in. I recognized him, sir, as one of the museum's junior acquisitions officers," answered Polly. "Mr. Abrahams, his voice was just like dry leaves rustling, sir, very soft. He told the museum man another piece, similar to the one the museum sought, was sold only last week. To a private collector, a man of singular tastes," replied Polly. Holmes's voice cut in, sharp and focused. "And did this Mr. Abrahams mention a name, Polly?" Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Polly consulted her notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. "He did, sir, after some pressing from the museum man. Mr. Abrahams said the buyer was a Mr. Silas Blackwood," Polly answered. "Apparently, this Mr. Blackwood is known for acquiring items the museum itself has its eye upon. There was an incident last month, too, with a Syrian tablet. Blackwood outbid them," responded Polly. "The museum man looked quite put out by this news, sir. He hurried away, clutching his satchel as if it contained state secrets." Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. A satisfied gleam lit his eyes as the low hum of the city faded, leaving only the sharp click of his mind at work. "Excellent, Parley. Your report is most illuminating," Sherlock Holmes said. He turned his gaze towards the window for a moment, then back to us. "So, Dr. Finch is eager to deflect scrutiny from his department's acquisition practices, and perhaps his own failures. Miss Thorne, with her meticulous nature, may have become an inconvenient observer. And now emerges a rival, Mr. Silas Blackwood, a collector who consistently outmaneuvers the museum." He looked at me pointedly. "This is no mere theft, Watson," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. His gaze shifted to me, alight with the thrill of the chase, a look that invariably signaled action was imminent, and I confess, stirred my own sense of anticipation. "The internal politics of the museum provide a fertile ground for misdirection, certainly," deduced Sherlock Holmes. He paused, a thoughtful expression on his face. "But it is this Mr. Blackwood who now piques my interest most keenly. A collector of singular tastes, as you reported, Parley, who snatches antiquities from under the very nose of a national institution." A familiar spark ignited in his eyes, one I knew well. "We must learn more of this gentleman and his particular obsessions. Watson, prepare yourself. Our next visit shall be to Mr. Silas Blackwood. The game, as Holmes was so fond of declaring, was most decidedly afoot." Indeed, the quiet whispers gathered by young Polly from the archives and shadowy shops had, to my ears, suddenly amplified into a most intriguing roar, promising a complex and fascinating investigation ahead. The intelligence gathered by the Baker Street Irregulars' youthful contingent, detailing the simmering jealousies within the British Museum, had given Holmes a new avenue of inquiry. Our hansom clattered over the cobbled streets of Mayfair the following afternoon, the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves a familiar counterpoint to the city's ceaseless hum, finally drawing to a halt before a residence of imposing grandeur. This was the dwelling of Mr. Silas Blackwood, a name now prominent in our investigation. A sombre-faced butler, his shoes making barely a whisper on the deep-pile carpets, admitted us. The heavy oak door closed with a soft click behind us, sealing us within a hall that spoke of immense wealth. The air was still, heavy with the scent of beeswax and old money. The only sound the distant, sonorous tick-tock of a grandfather clock echoing from some unseen corridor. Mr. Silas Blackwood himself soon appeared, emerging from a shadowed doorway. He was a man whose charisma was almost a physical force, yet whose eyes held a restless, fervent light. His voice was smooth, cultured, yet with an undercurrent of intensity. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," replied Mr. Silas Blackwood. He paused, his eyes flickering between us. "An unexpected pleasure. To what do I owe this visit from the celebrated consulting detective?" answered Mr. Silas Blackwood. Holmes's reply was direct, his tone devoid of pleasantry. "We are investigating the unfortunate disappearance of the amulet of Thoth from the British Museum, Mr. Blackwood. Your reputation as a discerning collector of antiquities is, of course, well known," stated Sherlock Holmes. A flicker of something triumph, eagerness, crossed Blackwood's face. He gestured expansively. "Ah, the amulet. A tragedy, a veritable tragedy for the nation. Such a unique piece. Come, gentlemen, you must see my own humble contributions to the preservation of history," said Mr. Silas Blackwood. He led us not to a conventional drawing-room, but to a study. The floorboards creaked faintly under the immense weight of its contents. It was a space so crammed with artifacts, books, and papers that it resembled a scholar's den more than a collector's display. The very air thrummed with a singular focus. One entire wall was dominated by sketches, diagrams, and notes. All pertained to a single object, the missing amulet. Blackwood gestured towards them, the rustle of papers seeming to fill the room. His voice grew more animated, his words tumbling out with a passion that bordered on the obsessive. "Its craftsmanship, gentlemen, unparalleled. The inscriptions, I have spent years deciphering their potential meaning. The museum, with their pedestrian interpretations, they barely scratched the surface, Mr. Sealers Blackwood said. His disdain for the museum authorities was palpable, his voice rising slightly in pitch as he spoke of his long-standing rivalry. He recounted tales of items he believed should have been his, often contested, he claimed with a sneer, at a highly exclusive antiquities auction house in St. James's, a place where whispers of provenance could make or break fortunes, and of opportunities lost due to what he termed the museum's bureaucratic timidity. Each word was laced with barely concealed resentment. Holmes listened patiently, his expression unreadable, his gaze sweeping the room. His eyes took in every detail, from the meticulously drawn replicas of hieroglyphs to the scattered volumes on arcane Egyptian lore, their pages dog-eared from frequent consultation. You have devoted considerable resources to understanding this amulet, Mr. Blackwood, Holmes observed, his voice even, declared Sherlock Holmes. It is more than an artifact, Mr. Holmes, Blackwood declared, his eyes gleaming. It is a key. The museum treated it as a bauble. I understand its true potential, said Mr. Sealers Blackwood. Holmes then paused before a particularly fine watercolor rendering of the amulet, one that showed an almost preternatural skill in its execution. He leaned closer, his sharp eyes narrowed. This rendering, Mr. Blackwood, he said, his voice taking on a new edge, is remarkably precise. The style is reminiscent of the work of one Antoine Dubois, a rather talented artist whose skills, unfortunately, often strayed into the realm of forgery, deduced Sherlock Holmes. Blackwood stiffened almost imperceptibly. A grandfather clock in the hall chimed the quarter hour, its deep tones seeming to underscore the sudden tension. He attempted a dismissive wave, though his voice was a shade too tight. An artist I commissioned some time ago. His name escapes me. One uses various talents, Mr. Sealers Blackwood answered. Indeed, Holmes murmured, his gaze unwavering. Dubois has a certain reputation for creating antiquities that are remarkably convincing, some even passing scrutiny at less discerning auction houses. He disappeared from Paris some months ago, I recall, remarked Sherlock Holmes. Our interview concluded shortly thereafter. Blackwood's earlier effusiveness had vanished, replaced by a strained, almost brittle cordiality. His farewell was clipped, the warmth gone from his voice. The heavy front door closed behind us with a dull, definitive thud, shutting out the opulent, heavy silence of the house. We stepped back into the more familiar cacophony of London street sounds, the distant rumble of drays, the call of a newsboy. Only then did Holmes turn to me, a distinct spark of anticipation in his eyes. Blackwood's obsession is a powerful motive, Watson, but that connection to Dubois is more compelling still. A man fixated on possessing an amulet who also employs a master forger. The path ahead begins to clear. We must locate this Dubois. I suspect his workshop will prove most illuminating. The prospect of finding a forger's hidden den, a place where deceit was crafted by skilled hands, sent a familiar thrill of the chase through me. The game, as Holmes would say, was once more afoot. Our pursuit of the forger, whose shadow touched Blackwood's obsession, led us not to a grand establishment, but to a narrow, forgotten fissure in the city's brickwork. It was an alley of the meanest sort, between a disused tannery and a crumbling warehouse, its air thick with industrial ghosts and London's damp. A chilling wind whistled through gaps in the decaying buildings, carrying the distant clatter of hooves on slick cobblestones. Observe, Watson. This stretch of wall appears newer than its neighbors, yet strives to mimic their decay. A most unconvincing performance, Sherlock Holmes noted. Holmes ran his fingers along the grimy bricks. I watched, breath misting, as he pressed a spot. No dramatic sound followed, just a subtle yielding. A section of wall receded inwards with a faint, gritty sigh, revealing an aperture darker than the alley itself. From this opening drifted a peculiar odor, a sharp chemical tang and the moist, earthy scent of clay. Good heavens, Holmes, a secret entrance just as you suspected, Dr. John Watson added. Striking a match, Holmes stepped through the opening. I followed into a low-ceilinged chamber, the air within more pungent still. It was unmistakably a forger's den. Crude shelves held unnameable tools, jars of powders and liquids. Unfinished statuettes and pottery shards lay on a workbench, some disturbingly resembling genuine antiquities from museum displays. Our artist is versatile, Watson, and prolific. See here the pigment residue, the careful application of false patination, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. My gaze fell upon a bin overflowing with broken attempts, testament to the trial and error of such nefarious craft. Beside it, a small, open sack drew Holmes's keenest attention. He knelt, taking a pinch of its contents. A fine, reddish powder. The distinctive red clay, Watson. Identical, I'll wager, to traces on the display case from which the amulet of Thoth was supposedly spirited. No mere coincidence. The stolen amulet was likely a clever substitution, the original spirited away, and a forgery left to incriminate Miss Thorne. Sherlock Holmes responded. Holmes rose, his expression thoughtful, surveying the clandestine workshop. Evidence of recent forgery was all around. The faint smell of drying glazes, still damp cloths, and fresh shavings of wood and stone on the floorboards, crunching softly as he moved. This forger possesses considerable skill, a knowledge of ancient techniques far from common. The question is not merely how Miss Thorne was framed, but who had both motive and the intimate understanding of museum pieces to orchestrate this. Blackwood has obsession, but this requires a different mind, different access, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Holmes paused. The silence of the hidden room was broken only by a distant, mournful foghorn from the Thames. He was, it seemed, already looking beyond this squalid workshop's dust and deceit, towards academia's hallowed halls. We had found the crime's means, but the true architect and their intricate reasons remained veiled. Clearly, our next inquiries must navigate the complex, unseen rivalries of that scholarly world. Following Holmes's disquieting discoveries in the forger's den, our attention turned towards understanding the complex human currents that might have led to Miss Verity Thorne's predicament. Mrs. Hudson, ever a source of unexpected connections, had arranged an introduction to Lady Emmeline Worthington, a respected Egyptologist and a fellow attendee of her Suffragist Salon. Thus, the following afternoon found us ascending the steps of a well-appointed townhouse in a quiet Bloomsbury Square, the muffled clang of a distant omnibus, the only sound to break the genteel stillness. We were shown into a study that was unmistakably the domain of a scholar. Books lined every wall, from floor to ceiling, their leather spines exuding a faint, pleasant aroma of aged paper and binding glue. A large desk, littered with academic journals and what appeared to be fragments of papyrus under glass, stood before a tall window. The gentle ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall was a rhythmic counterpoint to the low crackle of a fire in the grate. Lady Emmeline Worthington rose to greet us. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with keen, intelligent eyes and an air of quiet authority. Her welcome, though formal, was not without warmth. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, Mrs. Hudson spoke most highly of your discretion. Please be seated. I confess, the plight of Miss Thorne has caused considerable consternation amongst those of us who strive for a more equitable academic sphere. Lady Emmeline Worthington replied. Holmes inclined his head, his keen eyes darting about the room, cataloguing every detail with practiced swiftness. Lady Worthington, your unique perspective on the workings of the British Museum, and indeed the broader field of Egyptology, may prove invaluable. We seek to understand not merely the how of this alleged theft, but the why, Sherlock Holmes noted. Lady Worthington smiled, a wry expression that hinted at battles fought and not always won. She settled into her chair, the faint rustle of her silk dress a soft sound in the scholarly quiet. Ah, the why. A question so often overlooked, especially when a convenient scapegoat presents itself. And how much more convenient still when that scapegoat happens to be a woman of talent. Lady Emmeline Worthington answered. She paused, her gaze direct and knowing. Egyptology, gentlemen, for all its intellectual pursuits, is a fiercely competitive, and I regret to say, often prejudiced world. A faint sigh escaped her lips before she continued. A woman must be twice as knowledgeable and work thrice as hard to receive half the recognition of her male counterparts. Lady Emmeline Worthington replied. You believe Miss Thorne's gender played a part in her being accused so readily? Wondered Dr. John Watson. Her reply was immediate and firm. I have no doubt of it, Doctor. Verity Thorne is brilliant, meticulous, perhaps too brilliant for some, responded Lady Emmeline Worthington. Lady Emmeline's voice sharpened with conviction as she leaned forward slightly. I recall when my paper on the lesser-known dynasties was initially dismissed by a certain senior academic, who shall remain nameless, as a charming feminine fancy. Lady Emmeline Worthington answered. A wry smile touched her lips, though her eyes remained serious. It was only when Professor Petrie himself later corroborated my findings that my work was grudgingly accepted. Such, I fear, is the landscape. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes alight with interest. And within the museum itself, Dr. Finch, for instance, seems particularly eager to condemn Miss Thorne. Sherlock Holmes said, Alistair Finch is a man terrified of scandal and perhaps of competence that overshadows his own. He rose through patronage, not necessarily through groundbreaking scholarship. Lady Emmeline Worthington replied. She waved a hand dismissively, as if brushing aside an unpleasant thought. A young woman like Miss Thorne, with genuine expertise and a refusal to be cowed, could be perceived as a threat to the established order, a challenge to figures like Finch, responded Lady Emmeline Worthington. Her tone became graver. Consider this. If a valuable item vanishes, and a woman in a subordinate position is nearby, the conclusion for many is regrettably swift. Lady Emmeline Worthington said. She paused, her gaze distant as if recalling specific instances. The fire popped, sending a brief shower of sparks up the chimney. There are rivalries, of course. Competition for acquisitions, for prestige. An ambitious curator might see an opportunity in another's downfall. Her expression grew more somber as she considered the darker currents of her field. Or perhaps someone wished to discredit the department, and Miss Thorne was simply the most vulnerable target, responded Lady Emmeline Worthington. She looked from Holmes to me, her words carrying significant weight. To frame her would be to strike at her credibility, and by extension, the credibility of any woman daring to enter such hallowed halls, said Lady Emmeline Worthington. Holmes steepled his fingers, his expression thoughtful. So, the motive may not be simple theft of the amulet for its monetary value, but rather a strategic move within the museum's political chessboard or a strike against female scholarship itself, declared Sherlock Holmes. He paused, his gaze fixed on Lady Worthington, then shifted his line of questioning. This amulet, Lady Worthington, does it possess any particular significance beyond its antiquity? Any lore or legend attached to it that might inspire such machinations, stated Sherlock Holmes. Lady Worthington's brow furrowed slightly. The amulet of Thoth, indeed. It is said to bestow profound wisdom, even prophetic insight, upon its rightful possessor, said Lady Emmeline Worthington. She paused, a thoughtful expression crossing her features. Such beliefs, however fanciful to the modern mind, can still exert a powerful pull on certain individuals, particularly those, like Mr. Blackwood, who dabble in the more esoteric aspects of antiquity. Holmes nodded slowly, a new avenue of inquiry clearly opening before him. The intricate dance of academic jealousy, gender bias, and now the whisper of ancient mysticism, all converged upon the missing artifact. Our visit had certainly illuminated the murky depths of the museum's inner world, providing a far more complex tapestry of motives than we had initially conceived. Lady Emmeline Worthington's words on academic jealousy had clearly resonated with Holmes. The next morning, we found ourselves in the British Museum Library. Within its hallowed, hushed halls, the air was thick with the scent of aged paper and binding glue. Silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of a turning page or a scholar's distant, muffled cough. Holmes, for his part, was a study in concentration, his brow furrowed as he pored over obscure Egyptological texts. He had secured a quiet alcove, stacks of leather-bound volumes rising around him like ancient fortifications. For hours, the only sound from his corner was the dry whisper of paper. I occupied myself with a periodical, though my attention often strayed to my friend, observing the keen intensity that always signaled he was upon a scent. Presently, Holmes rose. He approached an elderly librarian, a Mr. Ainsworth, whose wispy white hair seemed to catch the sunlight like the dust motes dancing in its shafts. Their conversation was low, a mere murmur against the scholarly quiet. His voice, though quiet, carried its usual precise edge. Mr. Ainsworth, the Sekhmet amulet recently catalogued. Are there any anecdotal records, perhaps less formal mentions in the museum's older correspondence or acquisition notes? Replied Sherlock Holmes. The librarian adjusted his spectacles, his gaze distant as if peering into the past. His voice was thin, like dry leaves rustling. Ah, the Thorne amulet, as some now call it, a curious piece. There was talk, among the original excavators, whispers of misfortune for those who handled it improperly. Old superstitions, of course, but they cling to such artifacts, Mr. Holmes. One letter, for instance, mentioned a workman. He marked its supposed powers, and a sudden fever befell him, remarked museum librarian. Indeed, superstition, Mr. Ainsworth, can be a force of astonishing potency. It is a current that runs deep in the human psyche, often more powerful than reason itself. Wouldn't you agree? Astonishing. I thank you for your time, Sherlock Holmes responded. Holmes returned, thoughtful. Notes gathered, we soon found ourselves in a cab, London's streets a blur. The rhythmic clop of hooves matched my racing thoughts. At 221B, familiar comforts greeted us. Long shadows of late afternoon, Mrs. Hudson's welcoming tea, and a merry fire crackling in the grate. Outside, the city hummed its endless song. He began to pace, his usual habit when piecing together a puzzle. The librarian, Watson, confirmed what I suspected from those dusty tomes. The Sekhmet amulet is not merely an antiquity. It is an object steeped in legend, Sherlock Holmes noted. Legend, Holmes? You mean to say these mystical properties are more than just fanciful tales? I asked, somewhat taken aback. Dr. John Watson commented. He stopped his pacing and fixed me with his keen gray eyes. Fanciful or not, Watson, the belief in these powers is very real. The amulet, they say, brings fortune to its rightful owner, but woe betide those who steal it or show disrespect. Tales abound of rivals cast down, sudden illnesses, and inexplicable ruin, though I grant you, most accounts are second-hand at best, observed Sherlock Holmes. He gestured towards a small pile of notes on the mantelpiece. Consider the context, Watson. Egyptology is fiercely competitive. Reputations are built on singular discoveries. An object believed to hold such sway could become a powerful symbol. Its theft or framing another for it might not be about money alone, stated Sherlock Holmes. So, you surmise the motive is not simple greed, but perhaps a desire to harness this supposed power or to inflict its curse upon another, I ventured, trying to follow his line of reasoning. Dr. John Watson added, precisely. The amulet's true power isn't inherent magic, though its believers would argue otherwise. No, It is the conviction it inspires in those who covet or fear it. Such belief, Watson, is a formidable psychological force, capable of driving individuals to the most desperate acts, of twisting ambition into malice. It is a remarkable engine, this human capacity for faith in the unseen, capable of constructing elaborate motives and justifications where none might otherwise exist. This conviction, this potent superstition, that is the engine behind Miss Thorne's predicament. And I suspect certain individuals at the museum hold this conviction very strongly. Sherlock Holmes responded. The certainty in his tone was unmistakable. He had found his path through the labyrinth of academic politics and ancient beliefs. "Tomorrow, Watson," he declared, his eyes gleaming with focused light, "we visit Dr. Alastair Finch. I believe it is time he shared his beliefs on the matter under a more direct line of questioning," stated Sherlock Holmes. Echoes of the previous evening's discourse with Holmes on belief lingered as we arrived, the following afternoon, at Dr. Alastair Finch's sombre British Museum office. The air hung heavy, redolent of aged paper and beeswax. A profound silence reigned, broken only by the muffled footfalls from distant public galleries. Dr. Finch, a man whose usual demeanor was one of academic hauteur, greeted us with a perceptible lack of his customary poise. His fingers drummed a restless tattoo upon his cluttered mahogany desk. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, yet it sliced through the room's stillness with an undeniable edge. "Dr. Finch, we are here to speak plainly. The matter of the missing amulet has, I fear, taken a turn that implicates more than mere theft," replied Sherlock Holmes. Finch visibly stiffened. A network of fine lines about his eyes seemed to deepen, and he cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. "Implicates, Mr. Holmes, I have given Inspector Lestrade my fullest cooperation. Miss Thorne is clearly the responsible party. The evidence is undeniable," remarked Dr. Alastair Finch. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. I noted a faint tremor in Finch's hand as he reached for a water carafe, the glass clinking softly against its tray, his knuckles white. "Evidence can be deceptive, Doctor. Consider the security arrangements that night. A subtle alteration to patrol routes, creating a precise window of opportunity. This suggests intimate knowledge of the museum's deepest protocols. Such a change would require authorization from the highest levels, would it not?" explained Sherlock Holmes. A deep flush crept up Finch's neck. He dabbed at his brow with a handkerchief, his eyes darting towards the leather-bound volumes lining his walls, as if for refuge. The rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner grew more insistent, each beat marking the curator's diminishing composure. "The museum has procedures, contingencies. I assure you, everything was in order, or as much as it could be under the circumstances of Miss Thorne's betrayal," said Dr. Alastair Finch. His voice, however, lacked its earlier conviction. It was thinner now, almost brittle. "Our investigation, Dr. Finch, has led us to understand that Miss Thorne's alleged betrayal is but a curtain, artfully arranged to conceal a more profound drama. We are concerned not only with the amulet, but with the influence of Mr. Silas Blackwood, and more particularly with his rather detailed knowledge of a certain academic misstep concerning the attribution of a Sate period figurine, a youthful error of judgment from some 2 decades ago." Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. The effect of Holmes's words was instantaneous. Dr. Finch slumped in his chair with a soft thud, as if a vital cord had been severed. His pompous mask dissolved, revealing a man consumed by fear. The ensuing silence was heavy, broken only by a faint, wheezing sound from the curator's chest. His voice, when he finally spoke, was scarcely more than a ragged whisper, heavy with defeat. "He knew. Blackwood, he threatened to expose me. How could he possibly have discovered it after all these years?" replied Dr. Alastair Finch. The confession tumbled out, a torrent of hushed words revealing early ambition, immense pressure, and a fateful, compromising decision. Finch recounted misattributing a minor artifact as a young academic, desperate for recognition, to bolster a flagging research paper. It was a small piece, you understand, a fragment of little intrinsic value, he explained, his gaze fixed on his trembling hands. But I needed the publication, the esteem. I assigned it to a more illustrious dynasty, a fabrication that secured my first lectureship. Blackwood, the devil, must have unearthed the original, obscure excavation records from a provincial archive. He held it over me, a guillotine poised to sever my career, my reputation, everything, remarked Dr. Alastair Finch. The air in the office seemed to crackle with the weight of his admission. Finch buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking, a muffled sob escaping him. Indeed, ambition makes a demanding mistress, Dr. Finch, but fear is a far more compelling tyrant, Holmes observed, his tone now less of an accuser and more that of a grim philosopher. Blackwood, it appears, is adept at exploiting both. He coerced you into facilitating the theft, or at least into ensuring Miss Thorne would be the obvious suspect, Sherlock Holmes noted. Finch nodded miserably, not looking up. His confession tightened the focus of our investigation, away from Miss Thorne and squarely onto the nefarious Mr. Sealers Blackwood. Our next task was clear: to confront this master manipulator, undoubtedly a more formidable adversary than the broken man before us. The stage was set. The weight of Dr. Finch's confession still hung heavy in our Baker Street rooms. Blackwood's coercive hold over the doctor demanded swift action. Holmes had secured the use of a disused auctioneer's gallery in a quiet mews off Tottenham Court Road. The silence within was profound, broken only by the faint, rhythmic ticking of a forgotten grandfather clock in a shadowy corner. Its steady beat, a counterpoint to our own heightened senses. Its dusty velvet drapes seemed to absorb even the smallest echo. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and decaying fabric, a fitting stage, I thought, for the unmasking of a man who dealt in false histories. From outside, the distant, muffled clatter of hooves on cobblestones occasionally punctuated the stillness of the mews. Holmes moved with a quiet intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration. The soft scuff of his shoes on the wooden floor was barely audible in the expectant hush. He had called upon certain members of his Baker Street irregulars sisterhood, young women like Elsie, with her uncanny ability to blend into any crowd, and Martha, whose sharp hearing could discern a whisper across a busy street. Their keen eyes and ears, honed in the less salubrious quarters of London, had proven invaluable in matters requiring utmost discretion and swift, silent action. Elsie and another, whom I did not know by name but whose alertness was palpable, were positioned unobtrusively near the main entrance, their presence almost melting into the deep shadows cast by a gas lamp flickering just outside the grimy window. Its gentle, rhythmic hiss was a faint counterpoint to our hushed preparations. Martha, I knew, was stationed with a clear view of the rear alleyway, her task to signal any unexpected approach or attempt at flight, a small, polished button in her hand, ready to reflect a coded glint of light. A fourth, Holmes had mentioned, was observing Blackwood's known associates from a discreet distance in the street, ensuring no Confederates were lurking. His voice, when he spoke, was low and precise, cutting through the quiet without disturbing it. Watson, the replica, ensure it is positioned just so upon the velvet cushion, visible yet not ostentatious. Our Mr. Blackwood has an eye for display, even if his appreciation for true antiquity is selective. Sherlock Holmes responded. I carefully placed the facsimile of the Egyptian amulet, a clever piece of work procured by Holmes from a theatrical costumer, upon a small, velvet-topped plinth. The softest whisper of fabric against velvet was the only sound I made as I adjusted it. It glittered under the single, strategically aimed beam of a bull's-eye lantern, mimicking the allure of the genuine article. The silence in the gallery stretched, becoming almost palpable. It was punctuated only by the distant, heavy rumble of a late-night dray passing on the main thoroughfare, its iron wheels grating on the cobbles. Each minute felt an hour as we awaited our quarry, the ticking clock the only measure of its passing. Then a distinct sound cut through the quiet, the sharp crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel of the mews, followed by a decisive rap upon the outer door. The sound seemed to reverberate in the stillness. Elsie, with a barely perceptible nod to her companion, slipped away like a wraith to admit him, her own movements utterly silent. A moment later, heavy, confident footsteps echoed on the bare floorboards leading to the gallery proper, each step announcing his arrival. Mr. Silas Blackwood entered, his imposing figure framed in the doorway, an air of self-assured importance about him. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume." The voice was smooth, almost unctuous. "Your rather cryptic summons intrigued me. You mentioned an item of particular interest," Mr. Silas Blackwood said. His gaze swept the room, lingering for a fraction of a second too long on the glinting amulet before settling on Holmes. Holmes gestured towards the plinth with a casual wave of his hand. The movement was slight, yet drew all attention. "Indeed, Mr. Blackwood, a piece that has recently come into my possession. I believed you might offer an expert opinion on its provenance," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Blackwood approached the amulet, a connoisseur's smile playing on his lips. The slight creak of a floorboard under his considerable weight was the only sound. He leaned closer, examining it without touching. The silence in the room was taut, expectant. He chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound that echoed slightly in the stillness. "My dear Mr. Holmes, your informant has served you ill. This is a rather crude imitation. The patina is unconvincing, and the hieroglyphs, while passably rendered for the layman, lack the precise depth and tooling of the period. Why, the very composition of the faience feels modern. My own artisans, who are adept at creating quite remarkable facsimiles for educational purposes, of course, would produce something far superior," responded Mr. Silas Blackwood. His voice, filled with the arrogance of supposed expertise, had unwittingly provided the very thread Holmes needed. Holmes's eyes glinted, his tone suddenly sharp as steel, cutting through Blackwood's smug pronouncements. "Your artisans, Mr. Blackwood. The same ones, perhaps, who supplied Dr. Finch with certain items to bolster his early career, or those who furnish your extensive collection with pieces of such convincing verisimilitude that they deceive even museum curators. Your knowledge of forgery techniques is impressively detailed, almost as if born from extensive practice rather than mere observation," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Blackwood's smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of alarm, then anger. A sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden quiet. He took a step back, the heel of his boot scraping slightly on the dusty floor, his eyes darting towards the shadowed entrance, only to find the way subtly, yet undeniably, impeded. The two young women there, Elsie and her companion, had shifted, no longer melting into the shadows, but standing as resolute, if silent, sentinels. From the corner of my eye, I saw Martha move almost imperceptibly to cover the only other viable exit near the rear. Their silent coordination was a testament to Holmes's training and their own considerable skill. His voice was a harsh rasp, the cultivated smoothness gone. "This is an outrage. What is the meaning of this charade?" Mr. Silas Blackwood answered. Holmes replied coolly, his voice calm amidst the rising tension. "The meaning, Mr. Blackwood, is that your elaborate game of deception, built upon threats and forgeries, is at an end. Dr. Finch has already provided a most illuminating account of your methods. Your little slip just now merely adds the final, damning flourish," Sherlock Holmes said. The collector stood trapped, his face a mask of fury and dawning realization. A low growl, perhaps of frustration, rumbled in his chest, but remained unvoiced. The faint ticking of the old clock seemed to grow louder in the charged atmosphere, each tick marking the moments of his downfall. The evidence was secured, the architect of Miss Thorne's misfortune exposed. All that remained was to lay the full, unvarnished truth before those who had been so readily deceived. The British Museum boardroom was an imposing chamber, its high, vaulted ceiling seeming to press down upon us with the weight of centuries. I confess, even I felt the gravity of the moment. A long, dark, polished table dominated the space, around which were seated some half-dozen gentlemen, their faces stern and impassive, their silence almost a physical presence. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Only the distant, muffled rumble of London traffic and the occasional creak of a board member shifting in his heavy oak chair broke the tense silence. Miss Verity Thorne sat beside me, pale but composed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I admired her fortitude in the face of such daunting scrutiny. His voice, calm yet carrying an undeniable authority that resonated in the grand room, addressed the chairman. Gentlemen, I thank you for convening at such short notice. The matter before us is one of considerable gravity, affecting not only the reputation of this esteemed institution, but also the good name of Miss Thorne, deduced Sherlock Holmes. A low murmur, like the rustling of disturbed pigeons, passed amongst the board members, their expressions ranging from skepticism to mild irritation. One, a portly man with a florid complexion whom I recognized as Sir Humphrey Davies, a noted traditionalist, cleared his throat with a dry, rasping sound like leaves skittering across flagstones. Another, younger member, Mr. Alastair Finch, tapped his pen against the polished wood, a sharp, impatient rhythm in the tense air. Holmes, unperturbed, placed a small, velvet-lined case upon the table. The metallic click of its clasp was unnaturally loud in the ensuing silence. A small, sharp report heralding, I suspected, a significant upheaval. You have all, I believe, been made aware of the unfortunate disappearance of the amulet of Thoth and the subsequent, regrettable suspicion cast upon Miss Thorne. The truth, however, is far more insidious than a simple act of theft. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He opened the case with a soft snap, revealing not the missing amulet, but several smaller, less prepossessing artifacts and a sheaf of documents. The papers rustled faintly as he drew them forth. His explanation began, methodical and precise, his voice even and clear, cutting through the room's heavy atmosphere as only Holmes could deliver. He detailed our encounter with Mr. Silas Blackwood and the evidence of a sophisticated forgery operation. He spoke of microscopic inconsistencies in patina, of anachronistic tool marks on supposedly ancient relics, and of purchase records that, when laid out, unraveled a network of deceit. It was a masterful presentation, each fact delivered with quiet conviction. I watched as the board members, initially leaning back in their chairs with arms crossed, began to sit upright, their eyes fixed on my friend, their skepticism visibly eroding with each revelation. Mr. Blackwood, gentlemen, Sherlock Holmes noted. Holmes paused, his voice lowering conspiratorially. Has not merely been acquiring antiquities. No, he has been manufacturing them, feeding his own collection, and I suspect, seeding others, perhaps even this very museum's, with clever facsimiles to mask his true acquisitions. The stolen amulet was but a piece in his elaborate game, a genuine article he coveted, whilst Miss Thorne was to be the unfortunate scapegoat, her dismissal conveniently removing a knowledgeable eye that might have detected his broader deceptions. Explained Sherlock Holmes. As Holmes laid bare the intricate web of Blackwood's scheme, a profound stillness, deeper than before, settled over the room. The earlier rustles and murmurs ceased entirely. The initial skepticism on the faces of the board members had given way to expressions of disbelief, then dawning horror. I felt a grim satisfaction watching their composure crack. One could hear only the faint, rhythmic ticking of a grand mantel clock, each beat seeming to underscore the immense gravity of the revelations. I glanced at Miss Thorne. A faint flush of colour had returned to her cheeks, her gaze fixed upon Holmes with an expression I now read as burgeoning hope. The chairman, a man whose grey visage had grown several shades paler, finally spoke, his voice little more than a strained whisper, yet audible in the charged silence. "This is a most disturbing accusation, Mr. Holmes. Forgery on such a scale, it challenges the very foundations of our collection, our expertise," responded museum board member, chairman. His reply was sharp, cutting through the chairman's dismay. "Disturbing, yes, but demonstrably true. The evidence is irrefutable. Indeed, the true amulet of Thoth was recovered from Mr. Blackwood's possession only last night, along with the tools of his illicit trade. Miss Thorne, far from being a thief, was an impediment to his plans, her meticulous nature a threat he sought to neutralize," stated Sherlock Holmes. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. It is a profound relief to hear the truth spoken so clearly," Miss Verity Thorne answered. Her voice was quiet, yet steady, carrying the weight of her recent ordeal, but with a new resilience. Sir Humphrey Davies emitted a loud, indignant harumph, the sound exploding into the quiet, his face still a mask of disbelief. Mr. Finch, in contrast, leaned forward, his earlier impatient tapping stilled, replaced by keen, almost alarmed interest. Holmes then presented the final, damning pieces of his argument, perhaps the sharp tap of his finger on a particular document, emphasizing a point. He showed how Blackwood had manipulated circumstances to incriminate Miss Thorne, exploiting the very biases she had faced within the museum biases, I reflected, that had made her an easy target. The silence that followed this was heavier still, thick with the board's collective shock and profound discomfiture. It was a silence punctuated only by the occasional indrawn breath or the almost inaudible creak of a chair as someone shifted under the weight of the truth. Their established views, their confidence in their own judgment, had been irrevocably shaken. The implications, if what you say about these forgeries is true, Mr. Holmes, this goes far beyond one stolen amulet. Our entire collection could be compromised, replied museum board member Mr. Finch. His voice sputtering with indignation, Sir Humphrey finally burst out, "Preposterous! Blackwood is a respected collector. This, this is an attack on the very integrity of our institution by an outsider," replied museum board member Sir Humphrey Davies. "Thus, gentlemen," Holmes concluded, his tone leaving no room for doubt, "Miss Verity Thorne is entirely innocent of all charges. Indeed, her diligence nearly exposed Blackwood far sooner. The conspiracy was not hers, but against her, and against the integrity of this institution," observed Sherlock Holmes. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Sir Humphrey was now reduced to incoherent sputtering, a series of choked exclamations, while Mr. Finch looked grimly at the chairman. The full implications of the forgery conspiracy, the potential damage to the museum's prestige, and their own unwitting oversight, seemed to settle upon them like a suffocating pall. I felt a surge of triumph for Miss Thorne, who, though still pale, now held her head a little higher, the strain around her eyes beginning to ease. Her voice, though quiet, rang with newfound strength and determination. "And I intend to see that integrity restored, gentlemen. My work here is not finished," said Miss Verity Thorne. "The next step, I should think," he added, his gaze sweeping their stunned faces, "is to inform Scotland Yard. Mr. Blackwood and any accomplices must be brought to account without delay," explained Sherlock Holmes. The chairman nodded slowly, a deep sigh escaping him, the fight seemingly gone, replaced by a weary acceptance. The other board members seemed similarly deflated, shoulders slumped, the weight of Holmes's revelations crushing their earlier indignation. One could almost hear the collective deflation in the room, like air slowly leaking from a punctured vessel. The reckoning had indeed come to the British Museum, and the path to restoring its honor and that of Miss Thorne was only just beginning. I permitted myself a small, internal smile. I had little doubt that Inspector Lestrade would soon be paying Mr. Blackwood a most unwelcome visit, a development I rather looked forward to hearing about, perhaps even recounted with some theatricality by the good inspector himself. The resolution, once Holmes had laid bare the intricate threads of the conspiracy before the museum's astonished board, was remarkably swift. The weight of evidence against Mr. Silas Blackwood and his network of forgers was irrefutable. Thus, it was with a sense of grim satisfaction that we found ourselves, the following morning, within the somewhat austere confines of Scotland Yard. The air, thick with the scent of ink and damp wool, hummed with the usual bustle, yet it seemed amplified today. The incessant clatter of telegraph keys and the heavy, rhythmic tread of constables' boots echoed sharply from the cold, stone-flagged corridors. Inspector Lestrade met us near the main desk, his usual harried expression replaced by a distinct note of triumph in his voice. "A clean sweep, Mr. Holmes. A most satisfactory conclusion indeed," responded Inspector Lestrade. He gestured towards the cells. "Blackwood and his principal accomplices are all under lock and key. The man seemed utterly broken when we apprehended him at his residence, surrounded by his ill-gotten treasures. Desperation, Inspector, is a poor counselor. Blackwood's obsession with the genuine amulet, coupled with his access to skilled, if unscrupulous, craftsmen, painted a vivid picture once the initial layers of misdirection were peeled away," observed Sherlock Holmes. He paused, a flicker of a smile playing on his lips. His attempt to frame Miss Thorne was audacious, certainly, but ultimately flawed. He underestimated her resilience and, if I may say, the reach of our own humble inquiries, replied Sherlock Holmes. Later that day, a rather different summons drew us to the British Museum. The grand Egyptian gallery, usually echoing with the footsteps of visitors, was hushed, filled instead with a select assembly of trustees, curators, and senior staff. A palpable sense of anticipation, mingled with a certain solemnity and the faint scent of beeswax polish, hung in the air. The great stone figures of pharaohs and deities seemed to look on impassively as Dr. Alastair Finch, his usual pomposity somewhat diminished, stepped forward to a small lectern. His voice, when he began to speak, was noticeably more subdued, the customary boom replaced by a quieter, more considered tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, members of the press," Dr. Alastair Finch said. He began, his gaze sweeping the room. He paused, collecting himself. "I stand before you with profound regret for past errors, yet sincere relief at their rectification. The Sekhmet amulet affair is resolved, the true culprits apprehended, thanks to Mr. Sherlock Holmes' invaluable assistance," Dr. Alastair Finch replied. Dr. Finch paused again, then turned towards Miss Verity Thorne. She stood near the front, composed and dignified, her gaze steady, a stark contrast to the accused woman we had first encountered. "Miss Thorne," answered Dr. Alastair Finch. He continued, his tone now carrying a newfound and genuine respect. "Your scholarship, your integrity, and your unwavering dedication to this institution have been unjustly maligned," replied Dr. Alastair Finch. A murmur of agreement went through some in the room. "The Board of Trustees has unanimously voted not only to reinstate you fully to your previous position," Dr. Alastair Finch answered. He paused for emphasis, his eyes meeting hers, "but also to offer you the newly established role of Senior Curator of Egyptian Antiquities, with immediate effect and full autonomy over the department's research and acquisitions." Dr. Alastair Finch replied. A wave of heartfelt applause, more than merely polite, and a distinct rustle of appreciation rippled through the assembled company. Miss Thorne inclined her head, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips before her voice, clear and steady, addressed the room. "Thank you, Dr. Finch, and thank you to the board. I accept this position with deep gratitude and a renewed commitment to the important work of this esteemed museum. I look forward to contributing to its enduring legacy," responded Miss Verity Thorne. Dr. Finch then cleared his throat, a more formal air returning to him as he drew a folded document from his inner jacket pocket. The room fell silent once more, expectant. He announced, his voice firm and carrying clearly through the gallery. "Furthermore, the museum wishes to issue a public statement. It reads in part," replied Dr. Alastair Finch. He unfolded the paper, the slight rustle audible in the attentive silence. He began to read. "The British Museum acknowledges that certain systemic oversights, and perhaps ingrained presumptions, may have contributed to the deeply regrettable circumstances faced by Miss Thorne," answered Dr. Alastair Finch. He looked up briefly, meeting a few gazes before continuing. "We are therefore instituting a comprehensive review of our internal policies and practices to ensure that merit, expertise, and dedication are the sole arbiters of recognition and advancement for all members of our staff," answered Dr. Alastair Finch. His voice gained strength with this pronouncement. "We are committed to fostering an environment where all brilliant minds may flourish," he concluded, folding the paper with a decisive snap and giving a firm nod to the assembly. As we stepped out of the museum, London's familiar symphony enveloped us. Omnibuses rumbled past, a street vendor's cry echoed in the distance, and dray horses' hooves clattered on cobblestones. Yet today these sounds seemed to whisper of progress, hard-won but undeniable. Holmes remained silent for several blocks, his tall figure weaving through the crowds, lost in thought before he finally spoke, his gaze fixed on the bustling thoroughfare ahead. He mused, his voice barely above the street noise. "An interesting outcome, Watson. Beyond the mere recovery of a stolen artifact and the apprehension of a ring of forgers, this case has, I believe, served a greater purpose," observed Sherlock Holmes. He glanced at me. "Miss Thorne's intellect, so long undervalued, has proven to be her most formidable asset against a system ill-prepared to acknowledge it. It is a testament to the changing tides, however slow their turning may be," explained Sherlock Holmes. I agreed, watching a newsboy shout the evening headlines. "Indeed, Holmes, a significant victory for her, and one hopes a profound encouragement for others of her caliber," Dr. John Watson added. He gave a curt nod, his eyes gleaming with that familiar analytical light. "Precisely. However, the final act of this particular drama is yet to be played out fully. The genuine amulet, Watson, is still at large," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He paused, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. "Though I have every confidence its current possessor is feeling the considerable pressure of our inquiries, its safe return to the museum will be the true culmination," explained Sherlock Holmes. "And then," he added, a hint of anticipation in his tone, "I anticipate Miss Thorne will have a most illuminating lecture to deliver upon its true, and I suspect, previously unrecognized significance." Sherlock Holmes responded. His words hung in the air, mingling with the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor, a clear indication that our work and Miss Thorne's remarkable journey was not quite at an end. The prospect of the genuine amulet's recovery and the further scholarly triumphs it promised for the newly promoted and rightly recognized curator certainly lent an air of keen anticipation to what lay ahead as dusk began to settle over the sprawling city. As Holmes and I approached the grand edifice of the British Museum a few days later, the crisp autumn air still carried echoes of the institution's recent public pronouncements, acknowledgments of past errors, and commitments to a more equitable future. The occasion was twofold. Firstly, the authentic Ankh-Senra amulet was to be formally returned to its rightful place. Secondly, Miss Verity Thorne herself would deliver a lecture. Her reinstatement had been swift, her promotion to senior assistant curator now public record. A different energy seemed to emanate from the very stones of the museum, less of staid tradition, more of a burgeoning, if cautious, enlightenment. Inside, the lecture hall buzzed. It was already well attended, a diverse assembly of museum staff, academics, and interested public. A low murmur of anticipation, the scent of old paper and beeswax polish mingling in the air, filled the room. This expectant hum was punctuated by the occasional rustle of a program, the creak of a chair, or the soft cough of a waiting attendee. We found seats towards the rear. Holmes, as was his custom, preferred to observe the assembly unobserved. I noted several prominent figures. Among them were some who had previously cast doubt upon Miss Thorne, now seated with expressions of polite, if perhaps still somewhat reserved, attention. The atmosphere was thick with expectation, a palpable shift from the hushed, scandalized whispers that had plagued these very halls but weeks before. His voice, a low undertone, barely disturbed the room's gentle hum. "Observe, Watson. Notice the subtle alteration in posture amongst the senior staff. Less proprietary, are they not? More attentive. Miss Thorne has already achieved a victory beyond the mere recovery of an artifact," remarked Sherlock Holmes. As Miss Thorne ascended the small dais, a polite yet genuine smattering of applause rippled through the hall, the sound quickly absorbed by the wood-paneled walls. The official ceremony of the amulet's return, conducted earlier that afternoon, had been brief but dignified. Now, the artifact itself rested upon a velvet cushion on a table beside the lectern. Its intricate gold and lapis lazuli gleamed under the soft hiss of the gaslights. Miss Thorne appeared composed. Her earlier anxieties were replaced by a quiet confidence that suited her immensely. She began to speak. Her voice, clear and carrying well, devoid of tremor, first addressed the relief and gratitude for the amulet's safe return and formal reinstatement. Then, with a graceful transition, she moved to the heart of her discourse. "For many years," Miss Thorne stated, her gaze sweeping the room, the slight rustle of her turning pages barely audible, "the Ankh-Senra amulet has been prized primarily for its craftsmanship and the presumed identity of its original owner. However, my recent, albeit interrupted, research into the lesser-known hieroglyphs on its reverse side reveals a far deeper significance. These markings have often been dismissed as merely decorative." She paused, allowing a ripple of curiosity, a subtle shifting in seats to spread. "These glyphs, when cross-referenced with recently translated papyri from the Amarna period, do not merely denote ownership. They form a precise astronomical calendar. This calendar accurately predicts solar and lunar alignments with a sophistication previously uncredited to that dynasty. This amulet, therefore, was not just a symbol of power. It was a critical instrument of temporal and celestial understanding," answered Miss Verity Thorne. A profound silence followed her pronouncement. It was the kind that signifies not boredom, but absorbed contemplation, the only sound the faint ticking of a distant clock. Then a distinct murmur of scholarly excitement arose, a sound quite different from the earlier polite anticipation, carrying with it the scent of pipe tobacco from a few enthusiasts. Heads began to nod. I saw one elderly gentleman, a renowned Egyptologist I recognized, lean forward intently, his spectacles catching the light, his expression one of pure intellectual engagement. Miss Thorne, far from being intimidated, met this wave of interest with a calm assurance. She proceeded to elaborate on her findings with meticulous detail, citing specific glyphs and their corresponding astronomical phenomena. For a moment, the gentle clinking of a water glass against its saucer was the only sound, save for her steady, confident voice. Holmes permitted himself a rare, almost imperceptible smile, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Watson," he murmured, his voice tinged with dry approval. While her adversaries fixated on the object's material worth, Miss Thorne has revealed its true intellectual value. The forger, cunning as he was, merely copied a shell, blind to the pearl within. He could never have replicated such depth of understanding, stated Sherlock Holmes. When Miss Thorne concluded her lecture, the applause was no longer merely polite. It was sustained, enthusiastic, echoing warmly through the hall. Several of her colleagues, Dr. Alastair Finch himself among them, he who had been so quick to condemn her, were among the first to rise to their feet, their chairs scraping slightly on the wooden floor. I observed Finch approach her afterwards. His demeanor was markedly changed. Gone was the usual pomposity. In its place, a genuine, if somewhat humbled, respect. He engaged her in earnest conversation, the low murmur of their voices discussing her findings, a clear indication of her altered standing amidst the dispersing crowd. We made our way out of the bustling hall, the sounds of excited chatter fading behind us, and stepped into the cool evening air. Street lamps cast long, dancing shadows on the pavement, their gas mantles hissing softly. I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Not only had the case been solved, but a significant injustice was rectified in a most public and undeniable fashion. The rhythmic clatter of horse-drawn hansoms on the cobbled street, a familiar London symphony, provided the soundtrack to our departure. A remarkable turn of events, Holmes, I ventured, my breath misting slightly in the chill. Miss Thorne has not only cleared her name, she has established herself as a formidable scholar in her own right, wondered Dr. John Watson. Indeed, Watson, Holmes replied, his gaze distant for a moment, perhaps following the flickering gaslight on a nearby wall. The intricacies of human ambition and prejudice often prove more complex than any criminal cipher. It will be most interesting to hear Lady Emmeline's perspective on these developments when next we visit Mrs. Hudson's salon. Such networks, it appears, possess their own unique methods of investigation and indeed support. Sherlock Holmes noted. The atmosphere within Mrs. Hudson's Suffragist salon was a comforting balm after the recent turbulence of our investigations. A cheerful fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows upon walls lined with books and earnest pamphlets. The low, persistent hum of intelligent discourse, punctuated by the gentle clinking of teacups, filled the air, a sound far removed from the echoing corridors of the British Museum or the stark realities of Scotland Yard. We were gathered, Holmes and I, amidst a company of remarkable women, the very air seeming to vibrate with intellectual energy. Mrs. Hudson's voice, warm and inviting, broke through my reverie. More tea, Dr. Watson. Miss Thorne, you are looking remarkably composed, all things considered, said Mrs. Hudson. Miss Verity Thorne, seated near the fire, offered a smile that held a newfound confidence. The ordeal had evidently tempered her, yet her passion for her subject, so recently vindicated, shone through. Thank you, Mrs. Hudson. Composed, yes, and immensely grateful, responded Miss Verity Thorne. Miss Thorne paused, her voice taking on a slight, almost incredulous tremor. The museum, well, Dr. Finch actually asked for my opinion on the new display arrangements yesterday. Unprompted, said Miss Verity Thorne. Margaret Lestrade, ever forthright, nodded her approval, her tone earnest. A small step, Verity, but a significant one. It demonstrates that competence, when finally allowed to speak, cannot be indefinitely ignored, replied Margaret Lestrade. Lady Emmeline Worthington, her bearing as dignified as ever, added her perspective, her voice calm and measured. Indeed, yet the very fact it is considered a step highlights the incline we still face. Your ordeal, Miss Thorne, while ending justly, underscores the systemic prejudices that nearly cost you everything. Lady Emmeline Worthington answered. Holmes had been observing the exchange with his customary intensity, his chin resting upon his steepled fingers. As he finally spoke, the room quieted in anticipation. His gaze, usually so piercing when fixed upon a clue, seemed to soften somewhat in this unique environment. Prejudice, Lady Emmeline, is a potent blinder. It obscures facts, distorts observations, and leads even the keenest intellect down false paths. I confess, my initial assessment of the situation was not without its conventional assumptions. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. This was a remarkable admission from Holmes, and I saw Margaret exchange a quick, meaningful glance with Mrs. Hudson. A log shifted in the grate, sending a fresh shower of sparks upwards. He continued, his voice retaining its precise edge. The efficiency of your network, ladies, this Salon, proved to be an investigative tool of considerable merit. Information and perspectives were brought to light here that official channels, in their rigidity, would have undoubtedly overlooked. Miss Thorne's own meticulous research, dismissed by Dr. Finch, held the key not merely to the amulet's lore, but to the inconsistencies in the narrative of its theft. It was a detail, I recall, that Mrs. Lestrade first impressed upon me as significant. Sherlock Holmes responded. As Holmes concluded, his point resonating through the salon, a particular observation formed in my own mind. So, the very qualities that were perhaps undervalued in Miss Thorne, her dedication, her scholarly rigor, were instrumental in her own vindication, commented Dr. John Watson. I offered this, struck by the neatness of it. Precisely, Watson. One must learn to look beyond the expected, to challenge one's own ingrained biases. The most valuable evidence is often found where one is least conditioned to search for it. This case has served as a salient reminder of that principle. The human element, the societal pressures, these are as vital to consider as any footprint or cipher, explained Sherlock Holmes. Miss Thorne's voice was steady as she replied. It is a comfort, Mr. Holmes, to know that even the greatest detective acknowledges the unseen battles. Perhaps, in time, fewer such battles will need to be fought, answered Miss Verity Thorne. A murmur of assent went around the room. The fire glowed. The conversation turned to broader hopes for the future, and even Holmes seemed to unbend a little, listening more than he spoke. It was a fitting end to a case that had challenged more than just our wits, touching upon the very fabric of the society in which we lived. As the evening drew to a close, and we prepared to take our leave, the quiet hum of the salon, a testament to resilience and shared purpose, followed us out into the cool London night. I knew with a certainty that the ripples of this case and the lessons learned within these walls would extend far beyond the confines of Baker Street.